Welcome. I'm Carla Nielsen, Curator for Literature in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library here at Columbia and Curator of this lecture series. The series is sponsored by the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia and has the aim of showcasing research that makes the material artifact central to its questions or methodology, or which, like tonight's talk, interrogates the work that the book does as a cultural and epistemological as well as physical unit. We are very pleased to be co-sponsoring tonight's talk with the Hispanic Institute of the Latin American and Iberian Cultures Department at Columbia and with Columbia Center for Digital Research and Scholarship. I'm very pleased to be welcoming Diana Taylor and Alexei Taylor here. There are two more talks in the series this semester. On March 24th, Anthony Grafton, Professor of History at Princeton, will give a talk on early American book collectors and their annotated books. This talk is going to take place at the New York Society Library, which is on the Upper East Side. And on April 16th, back in this room, Lindsay Van Tyne, a doctoral candidate in English at Columbia, will present The Geography of History, Plotting Columbus and Map and Narrative. For more information about these two talks, please check our website, or if you want to be added to our mailing list, the mailing list is right over there. You're welcome to do so after the talk. So tonight's speakers are going to be introduced by Deneb Kozakowski-Valareto, who I will quickly introduce beforehand. Then we'll have our presentation, a short Q&A, and then a reception next door, which we hope you will all stay for. Deneb began her education in the Netherlands, I believe. Got those city names correct. After obtaining a master's degree from Leiden University, in 2011 she began the doctoral program here at Columbia, working in both Latin American and Iberian cultures and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Her research deals with the formation of the tropics, and the Amazon in particular, as physical, technical, intellectual, and epistemic frontier, as a physical and technical, intellectual, and epistemic frontier of modernity throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Deneb's research draws on both visual and textual, fictional and non-fictional fictional material. She has a parallel interest in digital humanities, and therefore many points of contact with Diana and Alexei's work. Deneb.
As Carla said, I have an interest in the digital humanities and have had the chance to take a course my graduate degree with Lydia Liu on the digital and the humanities, and previously in my undergrad, several courses in media and culture. And I have also been following the development of the cybernetic culture unit center for research that started in the 90s and up to this moment. I'll introduce our speakers, Diana Taylor. Diana Taylor is a professor, is a university professor and professor of performance studies and Spanish at New York University. She's the author of several books and publications, such as The Theater of a Crisis, Drama and Politics in Latin America, which won the Best Book Award given by the New England Council on Latin American Studies, Disappearing Acts, Spectacles of Gender and Nationalism in Argentina's Dirty War, The Archive and the Repertoire, Performing Cultural Memory in the Americas, and Acciones de Memoria, Performance, Historia y Trauma. With Rosalind Constantino, Diana has edited Holy Terrors, Latin America Women Perform, which is accessible at the Scalar online and digital platform. In her cutting-edge work on Latin American and U.S. theater and performance, feminist theater and politics has opened an interdisciplinary and prolific field of investigation and thought about embodiment and its practices, the performatic systems in which these practices are enacted, and the political and cultural dimensions of performance. Diana Taylor is also the founding director of the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics, a collaborative, multilingual, and interdisciplinary network of institutions, artists, scholars, and activists through the Americas. And as founding director of the Hemispheric Institute, she began working actively to develop digital materials in 1998. And with Alexei Taylor, she started creating digital platforms for Cuadernos, which are multimedia notebooks, back in 2000. And she has been substantially involved in the development of digital platforms ever since, and was awarded the 2014 American Council of Learned Societies Digital Innovation Fellowship. Alexei Taylor, he's a graduate of the NYU ITP program, which is a program that is oriented towards fostering creative uses of technology, media, and communication. At the ITP program, he focused on online graphic novels and storytelling. And he spent 10 years teaching graduate and undergraduate courses in digital medias at NYU and in the CUNY system. And during this time, he also provided technical consulting to academics, artists, and scholars through NYU faculty technology program. As the co-founder of Typefold, which is a company that develops digital publications and software, he focuses on a variety of authoring systems for classrooms, ebooks, interactive journals, and virtual museums that utilize maps, augmented reality, streaming data, and community. And he began collaborating with Diana Taylor in 2001 to create online, multilingual, media-rich journals called Hemispherica. When Alexei began working with Scalar in 2010 as a UX designer, user experience designer, and consultant, his focus turned towards how technology is influencing how we learn, how we read, and ultimately how we author. So join me today in welcoming Diana and Alexei for our talk.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
And, we wanted to thank you, and we want to thank Carla for the invitation to speak as part of this book history colloquium. So I'm going to start a little bit about how we got started with the digital book project at the Hemispheric Institute, and part of it had to do with absolute necessity. This was not a kind of a conviction that books had to become digital or anything fancy like that. It was that the Hemispheric Institute deals with or works very closely with scholars and artists and activists, as you just said, throughout the Americas. We have 45 university members, so from literally the Arctic Circle, which you're going to see tonight, down to Patagonia. And we had to be able to communicate. So there's no way of doing things trilingually unless you start working in the digital, because you can't just go out and publish, different kinds of translations of print books. So part of it was a necessity, and we started, as we just heard, with these web cuadernos, and web cuadernos were basically discrete in the sense of self-contained, small publications that had text, lots of media, and sometimes there were collections, a couple of these were collections, but there were scholarly projects, say here on indigenous encounters. Here we have the whole collection of the Museo del Barrio's Arte No Es Vida. They had a big exhibit, so we have the videos, we have all of those materials. So it's basically also scholarly research. We have an archive of video materials called HIDVL, the Hemispheric Institute Digital Video Library, that we do together with NYU libraries. We have a digital journal named Hemispherica, and now we are starting the digital book project. So, as books. So one of the questions is, why a digital book? What is a digital book? And what's at stake in calling it a book? So a book is, as Carla said, is a very specific cultural artifact. It's not just a form of transmitting knowledge. It's a very particular configuration of knowledge as somehow containable, bounded, silent, static, and permanent. And I just want to give one little example of this, which was in the conquest of Peru. Pizarro was the conqueror, and he went to meet with Atahualpa in Cajamarca, and he said to Atahualpa, "You've got to believe in our God." And Atahualpa, who was the Inca, right, the head, I guess equivalent to the king, said, "What God, what God?" And so Pizarro, or Valverde, the priest, handed the Atahualpa the Bible and said, "The word of God is in here." So Atahualpa takes the book and he holds it to his ear, and he can't hear anything. And so he starts shaking it to see if maybe that'll make it work, and he still doesn't hear anything, and so he throws it on the floor, and that's the excuse that they use to take him captive and to kill everybody there. So we were joking, if it had been a digital book, we wouldn't have had the conquest of Peru, right? You would have heard the word of God. So anyway, the book, and the reason that we've decided to keep using book is because book has such a cultural and academic weight and legitimacy. So the language of book helps us retain the idea of book, which is the way that books have offered us ways to organize knowledge, and we've moved it into a new platform. So this is what Catherine Hales would call a skeuomorph, right? It's a new way of using an old concept that's no longer applicable, because a book is not, in fact, what these things that we're doing are. There's something else. But rather than struggle over what that something else is, we've decided to go for book. But at the same time, the language of book covers very deep epistemic shifts. What we think about knowledge and knowledge production has changed with the digital. And the idea that somehow it's distant and stable and static and permanent, that it can be contained between two covers, is not anything that we believe anymore, right? So our whole concept has changed. But the digital, in many ways, is very useful too, because it seems more accessible, and it allows us to circulate knowledge through other things other than just language, through video, through music, through all sorts of images, and we can circulate it more widely and freely. We all know that. There's also something about the digital that gives us this kind of fantasy of endless access, right? Books are very bounded, as I've said. But the digital links us into these networks, so knowledge is networked rather than siloed. It moves outwards. It's nonlinear. It's interactive. We have the capacity to update things. Things are multimodal. We can include media, sound, video. For us, essential, of course, it's multilingual. I mean, we can make it multilingual. It's experiential. It's a fabulous teaching tool. It's also very, very fast. And the infrastructure is far more flexible, so that we can, for example, have a better grasp of theoretical models such as network theory or theories of assemblage that do not impose a linear form on a theory that actually challenges linearity. So there's many, many reasons to love the digital, but I think it's very important to understand that what we're thinking about are just major, major transitions here that are not always obvious, and some are epistemic, some are technological, some are economic, and some have to do with academic, the standing, if you want, of academics, and academic legitimation, or even scholarship. So I'm going to end my little blurb there, and Alexei will take over, and we'll just go back and forth.
So one of the changing trends that you were mentioning is the change of user habits, which kind of goes without saying, but we sort of refer to a lot of these things throughout the rest of the talk, so I'll just mention sort of the obvious, right? But we really got into thinking about these digital books when we started to sort of really confront the fact that everybody's reading on their phones, right? I'm just sort of new to that, and maybe not everybody here does, but more and more people are obviously going that route. So things are, as Kevin Kelly says, people aren't sort of reading anymore, they're scanning, right? There's this sort of kind of glancing and kind of getting a sense of the media-rich stuff that you see and experience on the web. So the gestural, there's also, the multitasking. So I was reading a book today on my phone, and then, of course, text message shows up, and then a Google chat pops up, and then it vibrates because there's an email, right? So it's always this distracted kind of sense of trying to read. So there's that challenge, right, is obviously comes inherent with the reading on your phones and with these tablet and networked devices. So that's one of the main changes that affect a lot of the ways in which we've been approaching these books. Other things are related to access versus ownership issues. So people are sort of less interested in owning things and more interested in accessing, such as of course, Netflix and Spotify, right? And these things where there are these subscriptions to be able to access things whenever you want, and how that affects the way in which these publications are being created, and also raises, of course, a whole million questions relating to how do you access these things when you don't own them on your machine and you're in the subway and you don't have the internet and so on. So this raises a lot of other issues. Another thing that's been interesting with these changing devices is for the first time we can really kind of clearly understand people's reading habits. So, when you assign a book in a class, how much of it is being read, right? When you publish a book, how many people actually read it in its entirety, right? And everybody says, oh, I loved your book, but how much did they really read? And with these digital books, and with the use of like Google Analytics and other types of tools, you can literally see exactly what people are doing, what country they're coming from, what device they're on, how many pages they visit, how long they read, what the bounce rate is. So, how many people just left from the first page and never dove in deeper. And so with these tools, it's very interesting to see how, and we've been using them in our sort of as research for our publications to really understand, like, how do we keep people here more than 3 minutes? And actually 3 minutes is really good. We're all like high-fiving, 3 minutes, we're doing good. So, there's these kind of ways of figuring out these sort of reading habits and how they approach something when you have this distracted reading on your phone, constantly bombarded. It's attacking you with your voicemail, your messages, and here you are trying to read a book. So the first thing is that we're faced with this sort of huge set of changing reading and user habits. Actually, I'm calling them user just to sort of, they're not technically all readers, right? When we're talking about these media-rich books, there's a lot of videos and listening and interacting, so user habits. So let me move on to the next section. Actually, I have a couple. Do you want to talk about these? We have a few of these screens that are sort of related to these changing habits.
Yeah, so these are images of the history of the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, or Jews in Poland, and that our dear friend and colleague Barbara Cushionblatt-Gimlet was the chief kind of conceptual artist of and helped really design the whole thing. And one of the things that's interesting about this is this whole entire museum, which is a very large museum, only has 2, quote, original artifacts in it. There's one coin and there's one other thing. And everything else has been rendered digitally into these amazing environments. And so here, for example, she's working with one of the books. So a lot of these books are very, very ancient, and of course you can't show them and so forth, you can't exhibit them, but they've digitized them and they've animated them. So for example, there's very little material about the, way back in the history of Jews in Poland, but there's woodcuts of like people cutting wood. So she's animated that, people pouring the milk. So there's all of these animated things. And one of the things that's stunning is that there's all these young people everywhere in the museum interacting with all of the displays. So they're reading the books, they're printing up tickets, they're publishing something else, it's incredible. So this way in which she's taken something that has been impossible, like reading these old books, and made them very actual, I think is one of the ways in which the digital has been able to renovate some of the reading habits. But we were going to talk about then the problems or the challenges of, of scholarship, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that for scholars and for myself has been very challenging about using the digital is that scholars, especially, more senior scholars like myself perhaps, feel that we have a certain expertise in our field, and all of a sudden, if we're doing something digital, we're complete novices and we don't know anything. And so it's a real upending of expertise that I don't know about you, but made me very anxious. And so I also had to, of course, collaborate. And in my case, I was lucky enough to be able to collaborate with Alexei, and we've had a long-term collaboration. We've been working on these books since 2001. But I think for people who don't have those kinds of relationships, it's very nerve-wracking. You don't know how that's going to work. There's also kind of an anxiety of loss, for me at least, a loss of a way of doing things and a way of, that I used to publish just by myself in my room, and I didn't have to worry about any of the other things. And so something else that is a challenge, I think, for people like myself, is that the writing online is different. It has to be shorter. I have to think about multimedia even as I'm writing. And I'm trying to create in the digital, we haven't been completely successful, but we're working on this, more immersive environments, because I figure, at least in performance, if we can create something that's more akin to the performance itself, that would be fantastic, right? So how do you create those immersive environments online? And again, this nonlinear argumentation, because you don't read a digital book from beginning to end as you would a book that's bounded, right? It's much more like this. And we're going to show you a couple of examples of this.
Sorry, I have to go back and forth between the web and the PowerPoint. So should I show Zapatista's first?
Yeah, you could. Yeah. So this is a Scalar book. We've been working in 2 different platforms. This is Scalar that's been developed by Tara McPherson at USC.
I'm just showing your essay, which would be the,
if you want to talk about the drop-down
scholarship.
You talk about it.
Okay. So we've been playing around with this term called drop-down scholarship. And one of it's sort of a response to this whole Google Analytics, people read for 3 minutes and they're gone. And so we're thinking about, well, what are the ways in which we're going to retain some attention when people are looking at these books? And one thing, when we started with these media-rich books, we realized that when you have a video on the screen and then you've got all this sort of deep scholarly text going on, people just go straight to the video. And then they're like, you know what, great, I'm kind of out of here, that's cool. And then they can kind of technically say, well, I've watched this, or I've read this, or I've scanned this. And so an interesting thing came up where we started to realize, well, the traditional table of contents index could be a plethora of kind of like, it could be whatever we want it to be. So this idea of drop-down scholarship was that we're going to recreate the table of contents to be an overview of the book. Rather than a list of chapters, it's actually going to be an immersive kind of experience, like a video. And so you might see this in YouTube, but they have ways in which you can tag videos and sort of little information pops up. So we're sort of taking that where we're saying, we're going to create a book, rich scholarly book, let's say it's got 10 chapters. Well, we're going to create a video for each of these chapters. And if you string them all together, you've basically got a sort of a complete overview of the entire project. It's quick to absorb, it's immersive, it's engaging, it's what people are going to do. So let them do it. And as they're watching, we've tagged and annotated the video with important parts that are featured within the text. So as you're watching and you're interested in a point that appears, you can click on it and the text just appears right up over it. I'll show you another example which is better. This is not exactly like that. This is in the same realm, but here what we've done is we've used an essay to be the table of contents. So Deanna wrote this essay that talks about all the other elements of this book. And so if you want to just get a sense of everything that happens, you read this essay. But as you're reading through, there'll be these sort of call-outs here to Zapaturistic differentiations and what else? What do we have here? Interview with the Zapatista. So these are actually links that'll shoot you out to the specific essays, but in a sort of a quick, easy to absorb way, people can experience this through here. I'll show you the other.
And then we have the women's, like here, for example, then we have some of the original documents, the Women's Revolutionary Law, so you can see that. Mm-hmm. We have, essays, like the video, the photo essays, and yeah, so there's a lot of ways that you can access all the materials.
Mm-hmm. I'll show the 6 gestures too.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just show.
And this is a different platform.
Yeah, so that was Scalar, which I'll talk about just briefly right now. I think a lot of you guys are probably aware of it, but it was, it's a content management system for making sort of long format online reading books, projects. They could be used for galleries or whatever. And also really introduces the nonlinearity. So there's a lot of ways in which you have chapters that intersect one another. There's also a whole series of visualizations that allow a reader to kind of say, I'm interested in all the media in this book. And you can click a button and it's sort of displayed in these interactive sort of like tag cloud type of things. So easy ways to get senses of like what the book is constructed of. So that's one project. That's Scalar. It pulls from archives all over the world. It's really cool in that you can sort of access all of these things through Scalar without having to go and find things and copy them and paste them, and it just sort of, so it's easy to use in that sense. And then because we are working really with a sort of a international community, multilinguality is very important for us. And we've also sort of, after working for 5 years with Scalar on these sort of like huge books, we found that they're very difficult to work with, and we've decided that we're going to take a step back and we're going to start with smaller sort of journals, let's say, or modules that could then become part of a book. And so this is Tome, which we developed at Hemi, which is a multilingual, immersive sort of platform, really designed for like performances and video and sort of full screen stuff. But I want to show you one thing here, going back to this sort of drop-down scholarship, is this book is introduced through this video, right? So you can watch this. This whole entire book is, okay, I'll play it here. I don't have the audio set up, but you could probably hear a little bit. I'll just show a little bit of this.
So this is in the Arctic. Our partners there.
Has a population that's now close to 2,000 people, or maybe slightly over. When I started the program, there were maybe 1,400 or 1,500 people here. We established the school in 1997 after a consultation visit in...
So but the point is, this video is an overview of the entire book, and then you can go in to the sort of more scholarly material below. So it's there. It's not sort of putting it on the sidelines. It's just sort of allowing people sort of a broader view of the scope of the work before they want to really dig in. And this is trying to address this issue of just people having a hard time reading online. Or people will read online, but it's really about teasing them in, right, through these things like magazines do with pull quotes and decks and leads and sort of beautiful photography and things like that. I'll just show a couple other chapters just to show, let's see here, the handshake, for instance. So each chapter is dealing with a different gesture. So we've actually gone and recorded these, and so you can see them and so on and so forth. So I can send the link out. But shall we move on here to ways of reading, or are you done with your section?
One of the things that was interesting for us too was what does this also do for readers on a different level? For example, I'm thinking about a kind of, what would an enacted readership look like? I mean, is that ridiculous? And by that is, if we can ever develop these more immersive places, right, it would be something like maybe more, in some cases, maybe even more like game technology, right? If it's immersive, and then the readership is more interactive as in the performance, what would that do to, quote, readership, right? So I think that's something that would be at least fun to explore. And so, you know, it's stuff that we're working with. And some of these, Alexei was giving you that overview of the ground, but there's also ways of entry that put you in a Google map. So you can walk around the space. And we're going to be doing that with the Chiapas book because there's graffiti on the walls. There's all sorts of fabulous things. So you're going to have like this experiential thing of moving down the streets and seeing all of this and then getting into the scholarship of it. So it's all of these different ways in which we're trying to invite people to think about the space and to think about moving through space, even as they're trying to, you know, get the other pieces, the scholarship and the sounds and all the other kinds of things that we wanted to present in that book, right? So in that sense, they're much more experiential.
Right. So that ties into really broader thing, which is just the different ways of reading. That we're seeing, and they tie in really directly with the platforms that we have been using. The first, you know, and the big one, Scalar, really sort of shook things up with the introduction of the sort of nonlinear, and also so the nonlinear, the data visualizations, and then also tags. And people who work in WordPress are probably familiar with tags, but Scalar has done it in a very unique way. Where I'm going to show you. Actually, we've got a great project that we did. Let's see here. I'll just go to English. So what is performance studies is based on scalar, and it kind of uses all of the scalar functionalities. So it's a great example to show. This is a collection of 30 interviews with scholars talking about what is performance studies. And we've transcribed them, we have translated the transcriptions, we've made subtitles. It's a 160,000 word book. It doesn't look like it, it's sort of very simple and seems sparse, but it's actually massive. And I'll just show you in terms of the ways of reading and dealing with tags. So we've used tags in this project, and what these do, to show you. So tags allow us to go through a body of text and outline the undercurrents, the themes that are happening. So embodiment and race and ethnicity could be themes throughout something that are, you be clear after you've read it, but again, how do you get people sort of overviews of text without necessarily having to read the whole thing, right? Or allowing them to find points of interest that will then start them off in a place that's sort of catered for them. So what we've done is we've gone through all of the discussions, all the transcriptions. We've broken it down into basic sections, like 10 of them here. Practices, discipline field, methodology. Sorry, it's very small. Is it very small up there? Yeah, it's kind of better. Methodologies, geographies, terminologies, politics. So if, let's just say we go to politics. Do we have anything under politics? Yes. Okay, so under politics here, we'll see we have race, political, post-colonialism, feminism, gender sexuality, queer, activism. So if I was to go to gender sexuality, we'll now get 3 more branches or nodes. Soledad talks about it. Diana Taylor talks about it. And Tavia talks about it. So from here, we can then kind of understand, okay, well, what does Soledad actually also talk about? And we can see here if I was to explore all the other topics that she's involved in throughout the project. But we could also use this as an opportunity to actually go visit. So you can use this as a navigational tool, right? And it takes us to her page. And I'm just going to play a section of this.
Hola, mi nombre es Soledad Falabella. Trabajo en la Universidad de Chile, también asociada a la Escuela de Literatura Creativa de la Universidad Diego Portales. Además dirijo una ONG que se llama ESEO y se dedica a la investigación-acción. Gracias, Soledad. Dime un poco de...
So, point is, we've used tags as a way to organize and navigate through the entire project. We've also done so on a more micro level in that these are her tags relating to her transcript, and if we're interested in one of them, like say lens, we can click on it and it'll take us to the paragraph in the text that deals with it. So you can go from sort of a zero understanding of this 160,000 page book to identifying some of the core topics of interest, finding the person who talks about it, going to their page, and going right to their paragraph where they talk about it, right? So it's really trying to take advantage of these tools to allow us to cut through all of this stuff and find specific points. So that's the idea of tags as a sort of a really major way of, a new way of reading, and something that we've been sort of actively engaged in, sort of really pushing to the limits and seeing how that can work. A lot of people sort of question, so why don't you just have a search engine, right? A search thing can do the exact same thing. But it can't really, because search, you need to have a term in your head, and it doesn't explain or show you all of the collection of all the other tags that make up that volume of work.
And imagine in the trilinguality of this. These all have to be searchable in 3 languages, right? The work in this was so massive, I just get a headache when I think about it.
We learned the hard way.
We learned the hard way with this project.
We'll never do it again, but...
Not like this. I mean, one of the big problems was that we were translating everything before it was in final form, and then we had different translators because we have 30 interviews, right, in 3 languages. And so one translator would translate a word this way and another translator that way, so we had to go and have them all translated again. I mean... Well,
the transcribers were all completely different, too. So some would paraphrase and some would put every and then you mix that up and it's like the telephone game. It just ended up with something that
we were like, no, we're going to shoot ourselves right now. But anyway, we've learned some better practices by doing it the hard way, yes. That's for sure.
So this, we don't really have paths in here, or Scalar
has... We didn't do paths.
Yeah, we didn't do paths for this one. We don't have a whole lot of examples, but paths are actually a really unique thing that Scalar developed was the argument was we're going to allow you to create nonlinear paths, or paths that are a linear string of pages that then intersect with one another. But I think one of the more groundbreaking, revolutionizing thing that they actually did was actually have sequential pages, which is not something normally found on the web, right? Where you've got a main navigation that's core function is to allow you to get anywhere on the site with like a single click, right? And when you add that to a book, you're really causing a lot of problems because you're giving the reader too much control, or the user too much control. They're skipping the purpose. There's things that need to happen in sequence. Not all of the time, but some of the time that has to happen. So Scalar created these paths which allow you to string pages together and follow the sort of next, very passive reading experience, which is, I think, very important from a user experience point of view, that people have that passive experience, that they don't have to constantly be thinking, where do I go next? I have to click something, right? So that's another sort of breakthrough in one of these new ways of reading, which is actually not new at all, but it's very new when you're dealing with the web, right? Other things would be, so visualizations, I've shown you one. Media, we've looked at a couple of the media. I'll show you some more, actually. Let's bring up, in terms of media. So here's a tome project that we are working on right now, multilingual, via Grimaldi. This is one of the chapters we just happen to have up because it has sort of cross-section of all the stuff that we have. But immersive media, that could be here like a map, or in this case, it's just a photo of the front gate of this torture camp. But as you go through, you'll find this is part of an audio tour. So we've actually included all the audio.
Track 1. Location plan. Parque por la Paz, Villa Grimaldi, is located...
Right, so we've got sort of all this rich media that helps
interviews.
Interviews,
and I
video,
do want to
yeah.
say one thing. I did this one almost all by myself. I mean, that is major.
Meaning she did the technology part all on herself, which was...
I used the platform.
Yeah.
I used Tome, and I could do it almost, what would you say, 90%? All right. 80?
I'd give you a good 80. I'd give you a solid 80.
Okay, 80.
Yeah.
But 80.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a person who can only do email.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So for me, that was such an incredible thing. Was I could get more or less the look I wanted. Mm-hmm. I could get, you put the sound in for me. I couldn't do the sound things, although
right.
I could have if I had, taken a tutorial or something. But I mean, it was incredible to be able to have that for somebody who is as visually driven as I am, to have that kind of control over the material mm-hmm. was like a godsend. So that was worth noting, while the other things I could never in a million years have made those. So that was a major thing, because some of the language behind these projects is that they're self-authoring. I mean, an author can make them themselves. And that's very seldom the case. Mm-hmm. That's very seldom the case.
I'm going to talk more about that.
Yeah, okay. I'm
1
sorry
minute.
to intervene. I just was so excited.
No, I was excited too, because I would come, normally I end up like, look, just give me all the files, I'll put them up. And then I'd come and I'd show up and the whole book's there. I'm like, whoa, okay, this is working out pretty well. So one other sort of form, or new ways of reading, which we had talked about, was through maps. I did a project, this ASA, Scholars Under Attack, which was a really interesting sort of scholarly, I wouldn't call it a book, but it was a piece that was all revolved around maps. And so we've sort of taken those types of tools and thought how they can be used in sort of these sort of immersive table of contents, right? That the table of contents could in fact be a map. And so I kind of just put this together for today just to sort of demonstrate, but we've sort of chosen some of the points where we work, and then we've created pages around them. So here's Iqaluit, which is up in Baffin Island, where we did the filming for that, for the 6 gestures. And so this could be a table of contents per se, and you can visit the place. And then it takes us to the actual location, which you could set to like different levels. And I'll even like put our little guy on the ground here. We can walk around Iqaluit. And this came out of that sort of, that, I don't know, I'm sure people here, you get into Google Maps and all of a sudden you just start walking down streets, and then you walk down your street and hopefully you can find yourself that you were walking on the street that day that Google drove by, and it just becomes a sort of, you just get immersed in it, right? And so using this as a tool to also sort of accompany the stuff, you're really putting yourself in the place at the time, or at some time, hopefully somewhat recently. So these are tools, and then these places also have text and media and things associated with the particular location. They also have tags, so you can see that this was tagged to 6 gestures, This now could be, I don't think I linked it today. I didn't. But that there could then link you to a chapter, right? It could take you to sort of read more. So it's a way to sort of put that chapter in perspective. So those are some of the different ways in which people are reading through different kinds of tools. The next thing that we want to talk about, I've lost our thing, but it doesn't go full screen anyway, so it's kind of boring.
Oh, the dashboard? Right there.
No, well, okay, yeah, so here.
So this is the dashboard for Tome.
Right, well, our new section, authoring, design, and production.
Right.
And so this comes into actually what Diana was saying about sort of usability and the readability and what goes into these books. So traditionally, as a scholar, Diana would be kind of just interested in the writing part. And then that manuscript would be handed over to a press, and they would have a designer who was very familiar with margin widths and line heights and all the typefaces and whatnot. And there was a formula in place to make that happen. And everybody was happy and everybody had their job. And as we've started to work together, Diana writes the piece, but then it's like, well, we need the video, drop-down scholarship video to introduce this chapter. Okay, well, how do we do that? Right? Okay, well, we got to go film it. Well, okay, we got to get the proper, depth of field lenses, and the audio needs to be right. So all of a sudden you're learning all of these things. So what's become this sort of small sort of team of maybe one person or a couple people copy editing and whatnot has turned into this whole production, right? So these books have become really productions, and we need to have people who are videographers, sound engineers, oftentimes musicians who are going to be putting in sort of background music to these. Video editors, if I didn't say that already.
Yeah, translators.
We need translators, and then of course graphic designers, user experience designers, programmers. And these are also in a unique challenge, because I happen to be one of them, where a lot of these books are unique. They're not off of a chopping block, and they're each deal with different tools. So the design, you're sort of starting from scratch again. And when, of course, you introduce responsive web layouts and reading on the phone, the design of reading and keeping your users engaged becomes so much, it's sort of amplified, right? Because you're working with a person who's reading on the web, which has its own sort of baked-in set of rules, right? When you read on the web, if you don't find what you're looking for in 2 seconds, you're out of there. If you sort of get a fleeting thought that, oh my God, there was that, talk about drones over the Eiffel Tower, let me just go to the New York Times real quick. You're so distracted, you're so easy to leave that the book needs to be able to draw you in and keep you there. And so these sort of unique design challenges that come out of this, right? Other parts of the production, the skills, the photography, so you need photographers, so on and so forth, right? I'll show you one thing here, which is very small. The zoom in doesn't work, so no problem.
So this is the dashboard. Oh, there, you got it.
I got it. Okay. So to manage this whole production is also a big feat. So what we're working towards is a Tome is built off of it's a theme and a series of plugins built off of WordPress. And so this dashboard is a custom dashboard that organizes all the contents of your book. So it could be all of your references, it could be all of your maps, all of your places, all the different things that you are going to be using. And then what you do is you create chapters, or you could potentially call them essays and not make a book but make an essay. It has your media gallery, so you can visualize all of the stuff that you're working with. So it's a place, and it also allows for collaboration. So you can have your photographers working in here, uploading the media. Right, uploading the photography. You have external media, so anything that has embed tags. So you've got a person who's making a map box, interactive map, and then they can populate the map section here, right? So you have multiple people who all have their own expertise working under the same roof, right? All sort of in privacy and with chat functions. Like Google has chat when you're in Google Docs, you can chat with everybody, which is like the coolest thing ever, right? So bringing in these types of ways in which people can collaborate, and then at the end of the day, it's placing them together with the scholarly text, building up those chapters and making certain things public, right? So it's a whole new sort of way of team building, right? When you're challenged with all of these different sort of individual skill sets that are required, right? So shall we move on?
Let's go to the role of the press.
Yeah, let me go to. That was the cover of the Via Grimaldi.
Right.
don't know
So the role of the press. So this is something we're actively trying to figure out. And I think that there's a great will on all sides for presses to do more with digital books. And obviously it's clear, the impetus is very clear as presses have, smaller budgets, and so it's hard sometimes to publish all the monographs that people would like, and especially in the profession for tenure and promotion and so forth. But it's not clear exactly what the economic system would be for the press. I mean, it's something that we're in discussion with a lot. How do you sell them? Do you have a subscription model? Do you do it through an app? I mean, how do you do that, right? Because presses need to survive and need to have their money that comes in. So how do you do that? And there's all sorts of different kinds of digital books, as you know. I mean, you can buy a book on Amazon, you can digitize an existing book, but these born digital books are something that we're not sure exactly how to work with. And as Tara McPherson says, we need to rethink the very forms and practices of scholarly production. And that means, of course, publishing. So we're hoping that we're going to be able to figure out some of the challenges in the near future, and other people are going to figure them out in their own ways. But one of the issues is also like, where would the book live? How do we assure that it's going to be there in 10 years if it's living on the website of a certain press? How do we know that it'll be there? Do libraries keep them? Who is going to be responsible for long-term preservation of these books and so forth? So the number of questions that come up around scholarly publishing are very pressing. And one of the issues has to do with branding. I mean, right now, obviously the branding of digital books is very important for us because especially younger scholars need to have their works published in university presses. So what is the role of the press and who does what? So that's kind of unclear. With us, with our trilingual books, it's a special challenge. I mean, is our press supposed to be doing trilingual copy editing? I mean, what are the kind of parameters of that? And then the review process, how do we review these books? And also something about the time. A traditional book may take, 2 years between the time you hand it in, by the time it goes through the whole review process and changing until it gets published. But time is very different for a digital book. You can't just keep a link, you have to be constantly doing stuff to digital books. So that time frame has to also change. I mean, a lot of things have to change for this to be a kind of a seamless process. Another thing that's really interesting, and an interesting question that digital books pose, are what about a first edition and then a second edition? Do we close an edition off? Do we keep modifying it? I mean, what do we do with it? I'm all for the second edition, third edition. Just leave it at the first edition as it is and freeze it or flatten it or whatever it is we do to these books. And that's just going to remain the same. And then the second edition may have other things. Who knows? So there's all of that stuff that we need to worry about. And then you're going to talk about the pedagogical applications?
Yes. So a couple of things. First of all, these digital books really work. I've been able to work with a few faculty at NYU and NYU Abu Dhabi who are really sort of like actively pursuing how to integrate these types of tools into their classrooms. And one of the main draws is that these sort of nonlinear, networked-based projects, right, are very much in line with this sort of new way of learning, right, which is a networked model base of learning where you're learning through internet things and through friends and through these kind of collaborations, as opposed to the sort of more traditional linear teacher to student, right, that this network thing is becoming much more pervasive, and that these tools are very much sort of working within that sort of momentum. Other tools are obviously things like collaborative authoring. So how do people actually write together as a class, right? And piggyback off each other's ideas. So you start with one person writing something and then somebody else writes onto that. So you have these abilities to do this all sort of in real time, all from wherever you are at that moment, but all living together, right? And then through that also the ability to annotate books. So and it could be a book that was written within the class or annotated an existing book that lives elsewhere. So one of these books that maybe Diana has written, you could annotate it, and those annotations could be sort of have different privacy settings. So you could turn on the annotations for a book that you're reading right now if you wanted and see the author's annotations or all the people's annotations that have ever read it. And that's going to be able to be filtered, right? So you have things like a course in Chicago who has a fine art or art history course is teaching this book, and they've gone in and they've annotated it. But then over here you have a civil liberties class that is also teaching, they've annotated it. And so you've got the same book, but you've got this sort of three-dimensional understanding now of it, right? Which sheds different light. So very interesting how these things can be brought into the classroom and used and sort of, kept going and changing sort of through that. And the main thing that this brings about is the idea of community, right? Which is the sort of, I think, the ultimate goal with these books down the road is to create communities around them, right? That segues into the last part, which we're going to talk about, which is the preservation, right? But community becomes sort of the way in which you keep these books alive. You guys know, anybody who's had a website, that if you haven't been on there in a while, it just sort of disappears off into a corner of the internet, never to be heard of again. And then one day, 3 years later, you go back and everything's broken. You're like, oh yeah, I forgot about this thing, right? It's like things disappear, right? And we see that also with books, and we track them with Google Analytics and say, hey, one day, after 3 months of not advertising it, it's gone. Nobody sees it. Nobody's looked at it in 3 months, right? It's as good as gone. So to keep it in the memory, keep it alive, and keep it in use, part of that is through these communities that we're trying to create, right? Through these collaborative writings and through annotations and so on. Other things that we're dealing with, I'll let you finish off with the Iron Mountain.
Well, let me just get that out of the way first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Because I don't think this is really the way to go, but this is the way we're doing it now. Right now, we're doing it with preservation through NYU libraries. And so all our videos preserved there. Our website is a special collection of NYU libraries, and our books will be a special collection of NYU libraries as long as they're on our site, because everything on our site is preserved. And the backup for all of our stuff is Iron Mountain, if you wanted to show people what Iron Mountain.
Here?
Yeah,
we do.
I got it
Oh,
here.
yeah,
Okay, this is Iron Mountain. People drive around in these funny little carts. I don't know how far underground it is, but very far.
It's like a James Bond movie.
It's like a James Bond thing. So the idea is, if we get blown up by nuclear things, our stuff is still going to be safe down there at the bottom of Iron Mountain. And that's very reassuring to me. I don't think that's the way to go, however. I mean, I think it's great that it's down there. I don't care. But I don't think that that's how we keep and we preserve things. I'm a person who comes from performance studies, so I think about liveness, and I think that the only way to keep things alive is by use and by people using them. So we've had a couple of ideas. So do you want to talk about the metadata first, or the bookshelf?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, you
metadata.
do that,
yeah.
And then we'll introduce Dexter later. Okay.
So one of the big ideas, obviously, is the communities and creating these sort of collaborative annotating projects. The other that's really interesting that we're starting to play with, and actually with a lot of help from Dexter, is this idea.
Dexter's head of our website at HEMI. So he works with us at the Hemispheric Institute, and he's created our gorgeous website, and we're now redesigning the whole entire thing yet again. And Dexter is our person for that. So we work very closely, the three of us. Okay.
So we've been playing around with how metadata can be used to make these books last forever. And the idea with this is that right now we're using limited platforms. We're all reading on, a phone or a tablet or a desktop or whatever. But we don't know what platforms are going to be around in 10 years. We don't even know what we're going to be reading on in 10 years. Is it even like a sort of just a cloud that you sort of do things like this? Well, then all the stuff that we've done right now doesn't work in that. So if we're going to keep things alive forever and preserve them, we really need to think about a sort of malleable format that allows for anything. And so the sort of, at least for us, the sort of clear answer would be like, well, metadata. So all the photos that you bring in, or any media, has its own baked-in EXIF metadata stuff, other kinds of metadata. But what happens then, and what we're interested in looking at, is when you create a book and you bring in everything gets metadata related to the book. So there'll be different types of fields. Many of them exist, others might not. But so metadata relating to this photo has its own baked in EXIF metadata, but then it also has metadata relating to the fact that it has a caption that's this. This caption, it might have a caption related to what the author did in Photoshop when they took the photo, but it also has another level of caption, which is how it relates to this chapter. And it's in this chapter, and it's in this location in this chapter, and it also tags this tag, right? So the metadata includes all kinds of stuff, not just geolocation stuff, but tags in relation to the book that it lives in and to the chapter it lives in. And not only that, every text page, which traditionally doesn't really have metadata in the same sense, would have its own metadata in terms of, perhaps what is a pull quote, right? Pull quotes could have metadata. So everything could be taken down to its elemental level and then recreated in 100 years just by reading the metadata and saying, these two things were related through tags, right? They had that sort of non-linear relationship. Right? And so by thinking of that, you might not have Scalar or Tome or Apex, what's it called? I forget, there's a whole million. What's that? I forget, that's not the one I'm thinking of. But any of these book publishing platforms, right? They don't have to exist. And the screen doesn't have to exist for us to be able to look at these collections of materials and understand how they at one point lived. And if you were so inclined to recreate it within any kind of new format. So that's one, or two if we include the communities. Three would be the idea of a bookshelf. And this is something that Hemi is like super interested in, partly because of the sort of disconnected nature of all of our stuff. We've got people all over the place, and we also have books all over the place and different kinds of books. And one thing that we were talking about recently, just a few minutes ago, that things vanish into the web, right? People don't, if it's not in the public, memory, it's gone forever. But if we keep them in discussion, right, then they continue to live. And so by featuring them within a bookshelf, they're constantly revolving, and they are being referenced by new books. And these referencing things could be as simple as tags and things like read time, right? Which doesn't really work when you have videos in your book, and it's like it's an 8-minute read, but it's an 18-hour watch time, right? But the point is, you could organize it according to those kinds of things. So like just like Medium does, right? You start reading one story, it's like, this is a really cool story. I love this writer. I'm going to sort of follow other things. And one of those other things was something that was written 6 months ago and has already sort of vanished, but now here it is again in discussion. So by creating tags and tying together themes and authors and read lengths, watch lengths, and all these types of other criteria, organizing them within this one place that draws attention, that brings users and participants, and keeps these things going, right? Do you want to talk more about the bookshelf?
No, not at all. I just want you to show it if you can.
Oh, yes.
And this is something that Dexter did for us today because we've been talking about it forever. So we have to have something to show at least. So this is a kind of a sketch of what this would look like. Mm-hmm.
So the idea with this is we would have sort of what's new, right? In different categories, you could filter it out by books. We've been working with these different levels. So of course we've got on the one end, we've got the book. But then there's also things like what would be like a journal or a digital zine, right? Then we have things even more sort of informal that would be like featured research projects that anybody could write. And they could be set to private, or just set to just be viewed within a class, right? So we have all these different levels of things that you can filter through. They're all linked and interconnected. So you start reading this one sort of informal thing that mentions something else, and you've now skipped around and you're really sort of covering the gamut of all the different things that we feature. They also have reviews of the book. You could even introduce some sort of peer review process. That would be a private. There's featured media that can come from these. This doesn't have all of it, but if you could imagine ways to sort of get attention, you've got a quick video that's featured from one of these books, right? So you actually start
interviews with authors, discussions, and so on. Right.
So pulling, enticing little clips from the book and feature that at the top, and then that gets you reading that, gets you watching that, and then gets you interested in that book, and so on and so forth. So it's about just getting that participation and keeping that readership going. So this is our big sort of moving forward thing, is developing this, because this is actually very complicated because it has to tie in technically with all of the books. So if you create a book that has tags and obviously has an author and has maps, the bookshelf needs to know that. It needs to understand how to organize that, right? So if you've made it public to the bookshelf needs to be able to search and understand the structure of your book, pull out things like maps, featured in sort of like a map area of the bookshelf. So look at all the maps from our books, right? New ways to get people in there. So it's a technically very sort of dense, and we've got to really think through all these sort of types of user cases. But that is our sort of big initiative now.
Yes, so that's basically it. So if people have questions or comments.
Question. So in the traditional book, the linearity and the structure and the sort of persistence of it all sort of reinforces the authority of the author. I'm wondering, you sort of touched on this, I think at various points, including your confession of anxiety. I'm wondering what happens with scholarly books, or I suppose any book, to scholarly authority, given the transience, given the mutability and all of these other things. Is that something that worries you? Is that something that will need to be preserved through technological means?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just start. So in one of the early Scalar iterations that came out, one of its first versions, readers had the ability to change the view. So I'm going to change this view to put all the media on this side of the page, or remove the media so I can just focus on the text. It had a strong emphasis on these intersecting paths. So this choose your own adventure. And the big problem, the glaring issue, is like it's undermining the author's authority here, right? If it's like, well, I wrote this, but kind of look at it any way you want, kind of thing, right? As opposed to, no, this is how it's supposed to be experienced, right? And so that's definitely a huge concern, and has been one that we've addressed through a few things. One is the later versions of Scalar that we're actually designing right now are completely different and remove a lot of that control that the reader has. Another thing on more of the conceptual way in which you'd approach writing the book is twofold. One is there's a clear linear element to it that is just, there's a start and there's a finish. And we encourage you to read that at some point. That's right. But on the other side, here are a list of themes and other issues that live in here that you can use as sort of jumping in points. So you're not taking away the sort of structure that is the author's structure, but you're also allowing, right? There's sort of like, I see there's two kinds of readers here. One is the sort of first-time reader that doesn't know what this book is about, and there's just like, well, I have to read it for an assignment or whatever it is. They sit down in this sort of linear part and they read it from start to finish. The second kind of reader is somebody that uses it as a research tool. They're gonna cite it, and they're going to whatever, and they know about it already, and they know what they're looking for, and they can go now to these alternate reading, using views that have things like data visualizations and tags to help isolate and identify the particular areas of interest quickly, right, and understand the overview. So I think that answered, or that's my attempt to answer that. I think it's the same challenge we've been dealing with, and those are the two things that we've tried so far to counter that.
I would say that not all kind of scholarship is going to adapt to this or be good for this. I don't think that all books should be digital books, and I don't think that digital is going to replace print. If you think about a 300-page book, that's a very dense scholarly tome, you probably don't want a digital book made of that, right? I mean, it wouldn't be the right format for it. I think what it enables is a different kind of way of thinking about knowledge production that can allow for the more immersive and the more experiential dimensions that some people in some fields find very necessary. So for me in performance, that's a big draw, right? In multilinguality, that's a big draw. But I like writing my own books too, in the solitude of my study. So I don't think, they're not the same experience for me. They're different. They do different things. But I do think that as long as scholarship wants to be part of the world and not just completely separated off in, the kind of proverbial ivory tower type thing. These other books are going to be more accessible to a whole lot of readers. And the others will maybe become more and more specialized. I'm not sure. I don't know. That's just my reaction now, having done both.
If I could maybe take that question one step further, because I'm wondering about the possibilities of continual improvement. I've heard of authors who engage the reader in the writing process. Comments on a draft affect what the author chooses to say in the next draft and so forth. Here you could also see, using the kind of tools that you've described about understanding how users are engaging with the book, to say, this feature isn't really working, I want to change it. You just sum that and saying, well, do we have first edition, second edition, or is it more of a continuum? Have you been thinking about those questions?
Well, the continuum is a problem, and that's where the versioning comes.
Yeah.
Because one thing with a website, anybody who's ever had a website, the first thing you know is your website is never, ever done. Right? It's like, oh, here, take a look at my website. It's a couple things need to be fixed. That's always the sort of. So these need to be sort of done, and they need to not change. So, but the versioning approach says we'll do a version 1. You put a stamp, you flatten it, which means you remove all kind of dynamic code that pulls in anything from anywhere else, except for streaming media from specific archives. Flattens it, so there's no more editing. That typo is a typo there forever. You can quickly make a second draft and fix the typo and stamp that one out. But so it's those kinds of things that are really trying to avoid. And yes, each one of those versions, I mean, just with Tome, every week we've got a new version that has new things that tackles these same issues. Somebody says, I don't understand the drop pin. It looks more like a teardrop. Or, it's like, oh, yeah, let's fix that. So there's a million versions. So no problem with that. But yeah, the continuation thing is definitely something where we don't want to keep going back to the same one and tweaking it. Because also what happens when people annotate text, and then you've removed that paragraph. Right? Yes. Yes.
I think in the digital world, edition ceases to be a real term. Oxford University Press revises the Oxford English Dictionary every week, every day. I don't know how often they upload it. And they will declare a new edition, I dare say, perhaps at some point. But it's really a meaningless term, I think, because the day after they declare the 3rd edition, they'll continue revising it, so it's 3.1. I mean, and it ceases to have any validity. My question, that's a comment, I wanted to ask you, this all seems very expensive. I mean, it's quite expensive to publish a book. But to publish it in 3 languages with all the bells and whistles that you've got going on there, is the press you're using NYU Press? Because I don't expect they can. Are you getting funding from some general source?
We do fundraising, grant writing constantly.
But it is expensive.
It's incredibly expensive. What is performance studies? We estimated it's cost us what? $45,000 to make that?
Not including the labor of the full-time people who are building it. So that's like translators and, right? I mean, it's really video editors and things like that, not, right? Yeah. But let's also, one thing in fairness, what is performance studies was like a massive thing. It was our first one. It was like, let's try the hardest thing ever done as our first time, and we don't know what we're doing. So in all fairness, it could have been cheaper. There was no model in place, right? So I think, I always go to this like the MySpace versus Facebook kind of thing, where MySpace failed because everybody could design what they wanted and they made it look horrible. And so you never wanted to look at something that has flashing neon lights. Facebook doesn't have anything that you can change, but it has a formula that works. And people just say, what, after a while, it's like, I'm not going to say, well, I want the images over here. No, it just does this. And your brain has now sort of started to construct things within that formula. So hopefully, and the big dream here is that we can create platforms where people can sort of author for that platform. It's enough standing and reputation. It's a stable type of thing that people will author for that. And we've seen even with some of these other books, the Via Grimaldi and the Ciervo Encantado and some of these other ones that we're working on, we can basically make them in a week. So yes, there's a lot of time that comes up to that in terms of photography and writing, but it doesn't cost anything. The platform's already there. You copy and paste the text. You copy and paste the translations. You upload the media, and it's done. Now, depending obviously on the type of media, so you get into a lot of video stuff, and then of course that gets crazy because you got to travel to the Arctic and you got to film, and that's just like. But when you don't have all of those types of things, right, you can actually get away with a very fast turnaround and a very low cost.
That's right. Kathy?
I've got so many questions. This was great. Thank you. I really liked at the end when you made the comment about how some tech things might still be better as books, and might, you know, that there are different genres and everything. I'm interested in carrying that further to think about which genres of digital products we might not worry about preserving in the future. This came up because I'm now a teacher at the Graduate Center at CUNY, and we're working on guidelines for digital dissertations. And one of our current students is writing a dissertation that's an augmented reality version of a life of an author, and doing original research for it, but also allowing it to be a game that's also partly about how you make a scholarly edition, but as augmented reality. There are parts of that I think you could preserve. Who knows if augmented reality as a genre is even going to be around in 5 years, right? You know, at my last university at Duke, we built this fancy six-sided cave that's so silly to go in there now. Who cares? I mean, you know, it's just it's a very crude technology, millions and millions of dollars to build it. So I guess what I'm interested in is how you make a decision. I'm not sure I believe that you could really capture, having done this for the last 10 years, all of the metadata such that you could really, really reproduce things ad infinitum into the future. Because it's not just the digital media you're creating that has to be preserved, but all the different platforms. So for example, the famous story of Doug Engelbert, when people wanted him to recreate his original mouse. He thought he'd be able to do it in a weekend, and when he died, he still hadn't been able to recreate the original mouse. He couldn't unlearn what he had learned in the last 30 years to figure out how to make the mouse.
Yeah, exactly.
I think there are many things like that, that there just won't even be the structures to preserve what we think is preservable now. So it's not the content. The metadata won't even have a place to live in the future.
True. Yeah. Well, they're also changing the standards. I mean, because different file types are becoming obsolete, and it's like, oh man, everything's in XML. We got to get it out because now the next form is whatever, and it's like, yeah, you miss one of those, and pretty soon you don't have it anymore. So, right? No, that's true.
Well, what do you think? I mean, so why it may be part of the built-in genre specification to this, in the same way we try to define the genre of a book, or within that subgenres like a novel or a poem. Maybe one of the genres of certain kinds of digital media is effervescence, that it has an ephemerality built into it. And maybe even like versioning, we might need a timestamp on it. That we will do what we have to do to keep this alive for 5 years, but this, after 5 years, it's anybody's guess. We can't take it beyond that. And I'm asking because we're trying to figure out how to do this for.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the challenges, and the metadata thing was really a response to how do you preserve a non-linear book, a non-linear where the relationships between things become sort of the interesting part, because you can preserve the text and you can preserve the photos and you can preserve the videos and just sort of put them in a box or a digital box, and there's your book. So I don't think there's a problem preserving them. The challenge was preserving the unique ways in which they're navigated, specific to the platform that was used at the time. And I think what you're saying makes total sense, that who says, I mean, tags is like so, you know, it's like so 2010. It's like in 2020, it's like, yeah, everybody knows about tags. This book was all about like how to use tags. So, right, I think there'll be, a lot of those things are not important. But it's definitely a question right now with these sort of and I think the questions are definitely changing every year, but one of the early questions was how do you preserve a nonlinear book in those relationships? And that was an attempt. But
an interactive book that is being recreated by your decision making, like a game or an augmented reality where your actual decision making is making that change.
Yeah.
There's no metadata for that.
Yeah, right.
No.
But you could make a video of that and then preserve the video.
That was actually my suggestion, is that we video versions of it.
Yeah.
That in fact, like helicopter training videos, you can actually train you photograph the game itself for training you photographs the maneuvers. So you make several of those, and that's what you preserve.
Right.
And the scary thing too, which is, scholars don't like to hear when you're talking about preserving a book, no, but is, that it needs to live on forever, but we're so completely invested in the new thing, and that things that happened last year, it's like, I don't want to read that anymore. It's totally like I got it already. So I don't know. I mean, there's also this sort of, it's hard to keep up with these. Yeah, Ken?
That's where I think scholarship is really different than what you would read on Medium or what you would expect in Wired. And the really difficult thing is you don't know what's going to be interesting, because like all your work is on areas that lots of people might have discarded if you had elites and societies deciding what was worth keeping. That would have been out the door. And so it's often the things like, oh, we want fugitive slave writing. Like what and librarian of the 19th century wisdom. So that the kinds of needs for preservation are not the things you would consense about needing to preserve now. They're usually the things that are at the margins of that. I think that's the difficulty.
Mariana?
Yeah, I mean, my comment relates very much to what Ken just said. It seems to me that by thinking so far ahead and conceding the fleeting nature of our attention, the distractedness with which we read, and sort of having these platforms determine how we author now, right? We're forgetting. I mean, first of all, we're out of sync with how scholarship's being evaluated, which is that dissertation. It's very hard to say. Tell your students, write a dissertation that in a couple of years will just have vanished into thin air. That's very hard to do. But also in terms of the kind of longevity and the way that scholarship, that we think of ourselves as scholars, seems to me the linearity is actually going out the window in the way that you're, in some of the ways that you're describing how we use and read and think. But also, I think the way we develop an argument is also very different if we're writing for print or for the web. I think the way we read a web page is that the main thing has to be before you scroll down.
Right.
And I mean, I've written for web publications. Your main ideas have to be in the first line, 2 lines. Sometimes in a book, that's not the case because we assume that you're going to turn the page.
Right. But here, for example, in this little book that I made, which was because I really wanted it so badly to incorporate the visual and the tapes, and then that interview that I did with Teresa Anatibia, which was so special and so moving for me, in a way, kind of the reason for being of this book in the first place, right, was that it's fine. I can publish versions of that someplace, and I have, and it'll live somehow or other. But for me to just take you on the walks that I did, those 3 sequential walks, was worth the price of, so it doesn't live forever. I'm not going to live forever. I'm taking you on my walks 3 different times of this place, 2 times with survivors, once with the headphones, and trying to explain what the difference is of my understanding of place and all of this was within that. So it was kind of modest in a way. It wasn't like this is something that has to be preserved forever, but I wanted you to get a sense of the moving through. And, it's, I don't know, I think there's something to this that I could not give you in a little book. So, and there's an argument, it's linear, you have no choice, you go from chapter to chapter, and just in case you didn't know that, I numbered them 2.1, which goes after 2 point, and before 2.2, or what, what I'm saying? It's like I tried as hard as possible to make it so that you would read from one to the next, and I would, do all the things that you do, like in whodunits, you plant clues, so you have to keep reading, so that it's important, and repeat the images like you do in theater to try to give it some kind of power. Yeah, so here's the interview. Just put that on for 1 second. It's so incredible. Just 1 second.
Juntamos muchísima gente, presos políticos que tuvimos ahí en Villa Grimaldi, y nos juntamos en un puente que hay antes ahí. nombre y caminamos en silencio. Era un silencio que tú podías tocar, ¿no? Hasta llegar al portón.
So she was a prisoner in Villa Grimaldi, had been tortured there, and she's talking about the first time that she goes back to Villa Grimaldi after it's made available to survivors. So there's something about her telling it in her face. It's very short. It's about 10 minutes. I just took that little clip from the interview. And there's something so moving that tells you so much more than I could possibly tell you about what this is about. So, yeah, there's losses. Yes?
Thank you. That's a really interesting discussion we've got going here. My background is publishing, but I've also worked with development, so this is totally fascinating to me. On the note of the lady who's being interviewed there, she participated in a project called Understanding of How It Was Going to be Presented. Am I right?
No. First I interviewed her, and then when I started thinking about this, I asked her about it, and she said she wasn't sure. So I showed her the clip that I was thinking about, and she looked at it, and she loved the clip. She loved the clip so much that she wanted to be interviewed more and more and more, because she says, I've never thought of myself telling the story, and I have so much to tell you. And this is very respectful. I mean, I didn't put in anything about, her being tortured. I mean, none of that stuff that I put in. This is just the experience back, and I was trying to be very careful. And so she was so excited about it that now we're going to embark on a much larger video project. So she's a co-doer with me, but I didn't start off thinking I was going to do this with this. It was when I saw her and seeing how much there was there that I thought, you know what, this would be...
So it's a precious moment to both of you, and
Yeah.
I'm going to link that back to the metadata that you were talking about before, and restructuring it as perhaps a sentence so that we can all understand and have the various component parts in a sentence that ends. But if you change around the order of the words in that sentence, the meaning alters completely.
Right.
And I'm wondering about participants coming into a project like this, which is a collaborative team authored project, how they can possibly understand that the intent and reality and respect for initial participation will be honoured in a form that cannot possibly be understood down the road if that format is going to be switched around in so many different ways by thinking that we can, and by meta tags, by whatever technology allows us to do to reorganize the intent, because we've got various blocks of content. So she could end up being presented in a way that, without any malfeasance, is dishonorable to her original participation.
Yeah, I can see that happens, and we know of artists whose work has been used out of context and used completely the opposite of what her intention was, and there's ways of abusing, just about anything, right? You take a sentence out of context, anything can be abused. These are non-downloadable streaming that live in an archive. I mean, we've done our best to protect whatever we use, and of course get consent, and all of our process has gone through like 22 lawyers. So, I mean, we've done whatever we can, but you're right. I mean, the possibility of abuse is available always for everything, right? Plagiarism, I mean, anything, right? So I don't know that this is any worse than, showing an image that can be taken out of context, or writing a sentence that can be taken out of context. Do you worry about it especially?
Well, I'm interested because of the connection you made about there's so many myriad possibilities in many dimensions that you can break everything down to a specific element. You can do anything with any component part of this amazing project. But the person with 4 leads, it doesn't have to be this amazing lady participates, do we have to think differently? I don't have an opinion, it's more of a question. Is the sentence or a question, should we be thinking about that?
All I can say is that we try to be as absolutely careful and safeguard the material as is humanly possible. I think after that, I can't say anything. I mean, we have this archive, we have 600 hours of streaming video of artists from all over the Americas in our HIDVL, our digital video library. And it's non-downloadable streaming. It's got the artists and whoever made the work has the rights to it. Their address is everywhere. For contact information, it's everywhere. I mean, we've done everything that we can do. Now, can somebody make a copy of it? Can somebody do something? You know, I guess. I don't know how beyond what we're doing to protect against that.
I imagine there might be a few more questions, but because it's now 7:30, okay. I would like to take an opportunity to thank the speakers, and then we can continue our conversation over the reception or informally afterwards. So thank you so much.